The studio lights burned hotter now, or perhaps it was just the sudden rush of blood to Reginald Worthington's face as the heavy door swung open with a pneumatic hiss. The control booth technicians froze mid-motion, one still holding a reel of tape, another halfway through adjusting a fader, like children caught in a forbidden room. Outside the thick glass, broadcasting house's corridors had already begun to hum with rumor. Word traveled faster than sound in these halls. John Lennon entered first, not striding so much as sauntering, hands deep in the pockets of his black leather jacket, eyes scanning the room with the lazy menace of someone who'd already decided the outcome. Behind him George Harrison, quieter, guitar case slung over one shoulder like a rifle. Ringo Starr followed, carrying nothing but his habitual half-smile and a pair of drum brushes tucked into his breast pocket. Paul McCartney came last, calmest of all, balancing a borrowed cello between his palms as though it were a borrowed library book he intended to return in perfect condition. No roadies, no entourage, just 4 young men who'd walked in off the street, or so it seemed, though the truth was they'd been tipped off 20 minutes earlier by a sympathetic producer who'd overheard Worthington's on-air sneer and dialed the Savoy Hotel in a panic. Worthington rose halfway from his swivel chair, then sat again, unsure which posture conveyed more authority. His tie felt suddenly too tight, the knot a noose of silk. "Gentlemen," he managed, voice cracking on the second syllable like old varnish. "This is unexpected. And irregular. We are live, you understand. Prime time." Paul set the cello gently against a stool. "We know. That's why we're here." His tone was polite, almost gentle, the way one speaks to a cornered animal. "You made a wager. £10,000. We're accepting. Right now." The red light above the microphone pulsed steadily, a heartbeat broadcast to millions. Worthington glanced at the clock, 5:17 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, December 15, 1965. The nation was still digesting tea, still half listening while children did homework and wives ironed shirts. 12 million souls tethered to this moment by invisible wires of ether. I assumed you'd send a representative, or perhaps decline with dignity," Worthington said. He forced a chuckle that sounded like dry leaves. "Bach's Chaconne, you said? The violin partita? That's not something one simply dashes off." John leaned against the console, close enough that Worthington could smell cigarette smoke and expensive cologne. "We don't dash, Reggie. We play." He pronounced the nickname with affectionate cruelty. "Paul's been woodshedding Bach since Hamburg. George reads music better than half the session players you've got downstairs. Ringo keeps perfect time in July 8 if you ask him nicely. And me, well, I can fake anything." Worthington's eyes darted to the control room. The producer, pale, sweating, held up both hands in a gesture that said we're committed now, no turning back. The switchboard lights were already flickering like fireflies, callers sensing something seismic. "Very well," Worthington said at last, straightening his jacket as though armor could be donned with posture alone. "But understand this, if you fail, if this is some prank, some mockery, the BBC will not hesitate to." Paul interrupted softly. "We won't fail." They arranged themselves without discussion, as though they'd rehearsed in some parallel life. George sat cross-legged on the floor, acoustic guitar across his knees, fingers already finding the opening D minor chord. John took an electric, volume low, ready to double the melody line. Paul lifted the cello, tested the bow once, rosin dust drifting like snow, and drew a single, resonant note that seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. Ringo perched on a stool, brushes poised over a practice pad, no full kit, but the whisper of bristles would be enough. Worthington cleared his throat into the live mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, an extraordinary turn of events. The Beatles have accepted my challenge. They will now attempt Johann Sebastian Bach's Chaconne in D minor, from the second partita for solo violin, adapted, they claim, for their instruments. I remind our listeners that this is one of the most demanding works in the classical repertoire. Let us proceed." He sat back, arms folded, lips pressed into a thin line of skepticism. George began alone. The first 4 bars were simple grief, a slow, descending ground bass that felt like footsteps retreating down an empty corridor. But George played it not as a mere foundation but as lamentation, each note given space to breathe, to ache. The studio's acoustics, designed for speech, suddenly felt too intimate, too exposed. Listeners at home felt it too. In parlors across Britain, teacups paused halfway to lips. Then John entered, taking the upper voice, fingers sliding along the fretboard with deceptive ease. No flash, no showmanship, just pure line, singing, mourning. The chacon's theme unfolded, noble and broken, and something shifted in the air. Worthington's smirk faltered. He had expected amateur fumbling, perhaps a few bars before collapse. Instead, these 4 were inside the music, wearing it like skin. Paul's cello joined on the 5th variation, low and dark, doubling the bass while adding harmonic weight that made the room vibrate. The instrument was too large for the tiny performance area. Its scroll nearly touched George's shoulder, yet Paul handled it with the same casual mastery he brought to bass guitar. His bow moved in long, singing arcs, drawing out overtones that shimmered like heat above pavement. Ringo's brushes entered last, not as percussion but as respiration, soft sibilants marking the pulse, the human element beneath the architecture. He didn't drum, he breathed with them. Variation followed variation, each more intricate, more emotionally naked. The music climbed through anguish into fury, then subsided into something almost prayerful. George's fingers danced across impossible stretches, John's tone turned raw, almost weeping. Paul's cello growled in the lower register, then soared. The chaconne, 30 minutes in its original form, was compressed here to perhaps 12, yet nothing felt truncated. Every essential grief, every contrapuntal cry, was present. In sitting rooms from Glasgow to Brighton, people stopped moving. A housewife in Leeds set down her iron and sank into a chair, hand over mouth. A retired colonel in Kent stared at his wireless as though it had spoken his name. Children who had never heard anything but pop forgot their comics. The nation held its breath. Worthington felt it too, the slow unraveling of certainty. He had built a career on separating serious music from the rest, on gatekeeping with polite venom. Now the gates were down, and the invaders were not barbarians but poets speaking the same language he'd claimed as his own. The final section arrived, the great climax, where Bach piles variation upon variation until the music seems ready to shatter under its own weight. George and John played in unison octaves, a wall of sound that was not loud but inevitable. Paul's bow scraped near the bridge for bite, then eased back into lyricism. Ringo's brushes became a storm of whispers. And then silence. Not abrupt. Gradual. The last chord hung, suspended, until even the studio's air conditioning seemed to hush itself. George let the final D ring until it faded naturally, pain leaving the body. No one applauded at first. The silence lasted 8 full seconds, an eternity on live radio. Then Paul lowered the bow. Looked directly at Worthington. Still think we can't play real music? Worthington's mouth worked soundlessly. His hands trembled on the desk. The switchboard erupted. Lights flashing red, green, amber, hundreds, then thousands of calls. Producers scrambled. A technician whispered frantically into a headset, "They're crying out there." Actual crying. Worthington found his voice at last, hoarse. That was extraordinary. He swallowed. I appear to have been mistaken. John leaned into the mic, grinning like a wolf. 10,000 quid, Reggie. We'll take it in small bills. Or a check. Whatever's easiest. Worthington laughed. Genuine this time, shaky with something like relief. Consider it done. But the money was already irrelevant. Outside, London was changing color. Pubs filled early as people recounted what they'd heard. Newspapers scrambled for evening editions. In Manchester, a music teacher played the broadcast recording, already being taped by enthusiasts, for his students and said simply, "Listen. This is what happens when class doesn't matter." Back in the studio, the red light still glowed. Paul spoke again, soft. "Thanks for having us, Reggie. And thanks for the bet. Sometimes you need someone to call your bluff to remind you what's possible." Worthington nodded, unable to speak. As the Beatles gathered their things, George slinging his guitar, Ringo pocketing his brushes, John lighting a cigarette right there on BBC property, Paul paused at the door. "Next time," he said, "maybe try listening before you bet against us." They left. The broadcast continued for another 40 minutes, calls, reactions, Worthington attempting composure, but the moment had already passed into legend. 12 million people had witnessed not just a performance, but a revolution disguised as a stunt. The walls between worlds cracked that afternoon. And though the crack would be papered over by critics, by snobbery, by time itself, it never quite closed again. In the years that followed, whenever someone spoke of real music, a quiet voice in the back of Britain's collective mind would whisper, "Remember the Chaconne. Remember 4 lads from Liverpool who played Bach like they'd lived it." And somewhere, in a quiet room, Reginald Worthington would sometimes play the tape. Yes, he kept a copy, late at night, when no one could see, and feel the old arrogance dissolve once more into something humbler, something alive.